There we are.
Hello. Hi there.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Yes, I'm very well, thanks. It's I'm in New Brunswick in Canada. It's a little earlier than I would ordinarily be anticipating engaging in deep political discussion, but I've got a cup of coffee and all is well.
Great. Good to have you all. So I think we are all set. Let me just get one final word from the organizer. If I think everything is on track, then we can perhaps begin the session. All right, so I have the final word. We can start. Well, once again, thank you very much, all of you, for joining us today, and thank you to Plus Institute, an organization based out of Austria, for organizing this. This is certainly a very important discussion that we're going to have. It's about the war in Ukraine and the future of Europe. I mean, needless to say, the war in Ukraine has had a huge impact on Europe. I mean, I have spoken to people, analysts, over the past 4 to 5 months, and most of them basically say that certainly what's happening in Ukraine right now is going to, in some ways, change the realities that we live in today, especially in Europe. So that's what we are going to focus here today. Let me introduce my panelists so that our audience know who are we talking to. Number one, of course, is Professor Ulrich Bruckner. He is John Monnet Professor for European Studies. And then we have Dr. Thomas Hughes, postdoctoral fellow at the Canadian Defence and Security Network. And we also have Professor Dr. Walter Fechtinger, President, Center for Strategic Analysis in Vienna. Thanks all very much once again for joining us today here on this important debate. Now, Walter, I would like to begin with you. You know, I mean, of course, we're not going to go into speculations, but was this war in Ukraine, could this have been avoided?
The big question mark behind the event, I would say. To come a little bit into detail, we see a war that didn't start on the 24th of February. It started already in March of 2014. So in this regard, we have two questions. Could this war in 2014 have been avoided? At least we failed. It's needless to talk about. And the bigger war that we are facing now, that is that of February this year, could have been avoided. I would say we could have seen the signals. I'm not sure that it could have been avoided, because it is only the strong will of the Russian president to fight that war and to wage war in this regard in order to obtain political aims and purposes. From his perspective, it was under-assessed, I would say, by the West and the European side. So we have a misperception on the European side and maybe the whole Western side. For many years, we did not expect that the war, such a big war, will come, such a big aggression will take place. So I would say it could not have been avoided because we underestimated the strong will from the Russian side.
Okay, so the war was basically inevitable. Now, let's focus on whether or not the actions, the measures taken by Europe were effective in any way in containing this war. Ulrich.
Well, first of all, let me say that I disagree with what has been said, because of course it could have been avoided if we would only know what exactly the objectives on the Russian sides are. So if Medvedev bluntly says, your freedom is our mistake, we allowed this to happen, and he's referring to all the countries that belonged to the Soviet Union or were under the influence of the Soviet power, like some sort of a cordon sanitaire, and he wants to return this into an influential zone. And we would have accepted what Putin said in 2007, that the biggest mistake or the biggest tragedy of the 20th century, a century that is not short of tragedies, was the collapse of the Soviet Union. If we would have accepted this, then there would be no reason to fight a war. But apparently no one is willing to pay a price like this. And so we could start on the assumption that our liberal belief in multilateralism is a form of wishful thinking that misunderstood how far Russia is willing to go. But of course, theoretically speaking, there's always a chance to avoid this, but no one in the West is willing to pay a price that comes with the end of sovereignty as a basic understanding of the world order that we stand for.
Okay, I think you have made some very interesting points. So as I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, what you were saying, President Putin's aim at this point is basically to reunite the Soviet Union. And that's why he is going ahead with this war. Interesting point there. We're going to talk about that in detail. But first, let me get some thoughts from Thomas. Thomas, tell me, what do you think about what we have talked about so far?
The inevitability question's fabulous. And I think everyone enjoys a counterfactual discussion. The challenge, of course, with those counterfactual discussions is that we can never know. Classically, I think I'm going to try and thread the needle between the two previous comments that have been made. I think it's absolutely true that the invasion on this occasion could have been avoided. But again, I think what would have had to have happened to avoid that is beyond the realms of possibility, essentially. Either, as Ulrich said, we would have had to accede to an extraordinary number of Russian claims or objectives, or indeed we could, if again, hugely hypothetical, if Ukraine had been included as a member of Nato in 2015. I'm not suggesting that that was ever on the table, but if that had been done, then that, of course, changes the calculus. Perhaps we wouldn't have seen an invasion this time. Maybe we would. So I think the key part of that question, what we're really getting at underneath the question of could this have been avoided, is what can European nations do, and from this side of the Atlantic as well, what do Canada and the US do to influence how Russia behaves? That's the bigger question, is understanding what motivates Russian action and how our actions, speaking on behalf of...
What do you think is motivating Russia's actions at this point?
I think a significant amount of this is a demonstration of Russia's significance on the global stage. This is part of... It's too glib to talk about international politics being returned to great power politics and everything being a triangular relationship between Russia, the United States, and China. However, it is a useful mechanism or lens to explain a certain degree of the actions here. And I think for Russia, their current actions are driven significantly by Putin's ideology and people around Putin, but it is part of ensuring that Russia, in its own perception, is not encircled, is not cut out of the big movements that are happening in international politics.
Okay, interesting points there. Now, I want to pick up on one thing that Ulrich mentioned there, that there is a problem within the West that perhaps reinforced Russia to do what it is doing right now in Ukraine. Walter, let me come to you. Now, you know, one of the claims that the Russians make for doing what they're doing right now in Ukraine is that NATO was coming right at Russia's border, and that, you know, in a way, somehow forced Russia to launch this invasion of Ukraine, because Russia sees NATO as a threat to its sovereignty. If I'm not mistaken, in the past, the West has made many promises to countries such as Georgia and even Ukraine at some point that, okay, you know what, we're going to take you into NATO at some point. But those promises, I don't know, were ever realistic or not. But up until now, when we see the reality, Ukraine is still not a part of NATO. If you talk to analysts, well, some people say that's never going to happen. So why even make such promises in the first place?
You have to consider that we have different actors in place. So you have the single countries who are interested to come under the umbrella of NATO. So it is free to them to want to join into NATO. The first point. So freedom of choice, I would say, for the single countries. The second one is it was not NATO pressure to bring the countries in. It was the strong will of all the countries to come into NATO because they were and they are still in fear of Russia. They remember the old times, I would say, and they do not want to have it again in nowadays. So it is the freedom of NATO to tell them you can come in. It's the freedom of the single countries who want to come into NATO. And it is the freedom of Russia to say, we see it as an aggression. I would say it is not an aggression from NATO side. It is really the freedom of our political system to allow different countries to act how they act. And it is more an authoritarian behavior to say you cannot come into NATO because it is not in our security interest and so on and so forth. So I would not say that NATO was pressing the Russian side. It was more the pressure from the Russian side on single countries and their historical behavior and memorial.
Who poses a threat to whom? Does NATO pose a threat to Russia, or it's the other way around?
If you look at the recent situation, I would say it is clear that Russia is really the aggressor in this case. And NATO itself defines itself as a defense organization, and I see it as a defense organization who can convene all the countries who are interested to be under that umbrella of defense. As you know, Austria is not in NATO, so we do not see a necessity to come into that organization. But the countries who have been in the former Soviet Union or in the Warsaw Pact, they saw and they see a strong need to come under that umbrella. But that does not mean that it will bring an aggression or a pressure or something that is dangerous to Russia from that side. So I would say that is very clear that NATO has to be seen as a defense organization, and Russia nowadays is the aggressor.
Interesting points there. Ulrich, let me come to you now. Since the onset of the war in Ukraine, I believe NATO has been at the forefront. I mean, as a journalist, I have seen Jens Stoltenberg almost every other week talking about the war in Ukraine, talking about how NATO is doing or perhaps applying measures to contain this war. What I would like to ask you is, how would you analyze the role played by NATO when it comes to the war in Ukraine?
Well, first of all, again, a mild disagreement with what Wada just has said, because I do think that the West imposes an existential threat on Russia, or at least in the perception of how Putin puts it. But this is not NATO's fault. NATO was in some sort of an identity crisis. They lost their mission when the Cold War ended. And ever since, they rewrote mission statements, what they are for, whether it's something like a world police force or whatever. But it was sort of a serious identity crisis until the invasion in Ukraine brought back a reason to exist, and it got stronger and more powerful and clearer in its mission than ever before. But the existential crisis doesn't come from NATO, it comes from the European Union. I live in a city that was divided, and it was always something like a beauty contest between the western part and the eastern part. And the people in the east were comparing what's happening in the west. And that, in the end, led to an implosion of a socialist experiment. And people peacefully decided we don't want the system because it doesn't deliver. If something like this happens with Ukraine, that is leaning towards the West and decides that it fully wants to integrate into NATO and in the European Union, then the comparison with what happened in Poland and what happened in Ukraine poses an existential threat on Russia, because Poland and Ukraine were basically on the same level in 1989 when the wall came down. But Poland today is 4 times richer and more prosperous than Ukraine. And Ukraine came to the conclusion that they want to follow the path of Poland, which means that if people in Russia compare their situation with the anti-Russia, as Putin and Medvedev put it, then they might come to a conclusion one day that actually it's so much better in Ukraine, and we should also think of a regime change in a more or less peaceful way. So this is the existential threat, and not that a parliamentary army like the German armed forces or most of the other members of NATO that need to legitimize any action in response to their demos could dream of something like an attack on the second largest nuclear arsenal in the world and the largest territory in the world. This is complete nonsense. Why would anyone in NATO attack Russia? So there is no such thing like an aggression or a vision of NATO wants to grow like cancer and they can't wait to include a giant country that is definitely more than a regional power, but it has been traumatized by what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it has been humiliated by what Obama said when he called it just another regional power.
Okay, wow, that's some very interesting points there by Ulrich. Thomas, let me put them to you. So it's basically not NATO, it's the European Union, which has played a role in emboldening Russia's actions in Ukraine. What are your thoughts?
So I think the critical first step is actually to unpack the term threat. What do we mean by the threat? And I think that the points that have just been made are absolutely spot on. I think that the idea of a NATO member or NATO as a collective force invading Russia are nil. I wouldn't even say slim to nil. And regardless of Russian conversation and discourse around that, I am also unconvinced that anyone in Russia believes that's possible. However, the reality that Russia uses those maps that we've all seen of NATO bases ringing Russian territory is I think important. I think that is perceived as a threat to Russia. But I think there's something that's a little bit nuanced that's going on there. For me, a threat is something which prevents you from achieving your objective. And on a very simple level, the first form of threat is objective as a peaceful state, for example. So the threat is, can somebody attack you? In this case, I think the expansion of NATO allowing membership from additional countries in more recent years, represents a threat for Russia because it reduces the possibility that Russia can coerce those countries. And if it can't coerce those countries, then it's less likely to be able to achieve any further political aims, particularly economic aims, which is, again, I think where the EU point comes in. So I think it's easy to kind of point fingers at NATO or the EU, but it's not particularly helpful in this sort of position. What would be really helpful, I think, is to understand what NATO or the EU could do to ensure that Russia does not see itself as being under threat. Because I often wonder if that conversation ever really takes place. It's this conversation around, well, we are going to do X because that is going to deter Russia from further action. I think the second question is, well, has it actually deterred them? And how have they perceived our actions as well? And similarly, flip that round. Can we really have an honest conversation with Russia where Russia can start to accept the negative impacts of its actions and in good faith move back from those? I think the reality is it's unlikely that Russia will, and that's a big tell about how they're approaching international relations. But I think that is a question that needs to be put to them and an opportunity that needs to be put to them.
Okay, Walter, yeah, I will come to you, but Ulrich, I see, just a few moments ago, I saw you shake your head there. Would you like to respond to Thomas?
Yeah. The term, it isn't helpful to frame it like this, is a normative statement, and the norm is not Russia's statement. The world is full of countries that see NATO as an illegitimate aggressor and a wrongdoer in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, in elsewhere. And so it helps to mobilize support from the Russian side in a situation in which the increasing pressure of Western sanctions isolate Russia, and they need a narrative to appear as the victim. So focusing on this is all NATO's fault and NATO is evil by definition is something that clearly resonates in China. I had several discussions with Chinese colleagues, and it immediately becomes emotional the moment you talk about NATO, because everybody in China knows that NATO has bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, and ever since the proof is we will be next, and not just our exterritorial embassy, but this is an organization that threatens China. And it will continue to do so the moment we reunite the one China and take Taiwan home. So similar stories are taught in South Africa or wherever you find people who flirt with narratives that are made in the Kremlin. And therefore it massively helps Russia to avoid the intended isolation that comes with the vote of the United Nations Assembly, and the 141 countries seem to be in line. And this is something that Russia definitely needs to avoid.
Okay. Now, Walter, let me come to you. I know you wanted to say something. Please respond to what we have just talked about in the last 3 to 4 minutes, and we are going to move to the next phase of our discussion.
Just 2 short remarks. The first on aggression. If NATO would be an aggressor, it would now intervene, because the military option is now the best from a military side to intervene and to defend the Russian forces. The second one is on threat. Many analysts say that the biggest threat to the Kremlin and to President Putin is a colored revolution. So he has to do everything in order to avoid a colored revolution and to have no negative impact and influence from outside, especially from Ukraine. So Ukraine is very dangerous for the regime in the Kremlin in regard with the colored revolution. So it has to be avoided.
Okay, good points there. Now, so of course the last part of today's discussion will be the future of Europe. But before I move to that, I have some questions about Ukraine in specific. Now, you know what, when the war began in Ukraine, I mean, many analysts at the time were saying it's likely for Kiev to fall, but contrary to the expectations of many, Kiev has still not fallen to the Russians. And just like Kiev, many other strategic cities have still not fallen to the Russians, but the war is still ongoing. So, I mean, according to some, this has already turned into guerrilla warfare, right? So if it does turn, or if it has turned into guerrilla warfare, to what extent does Ukraine as a country has the capacity to fight the Russians? And for how much longer can they continue to do that? Walter, let me begin with you.
Yeah. The first point, I do not see a strong impact of guerrilla warfare nowadays. We still have a very conventional war fighting. And we see that Ukraine is preparing for a counterattack in the western part, in the southwestern part of the country, in Kherson and so on, and also in the north in Kharkiv. So I would say the time is not ripe for a guerrilla warfare, but what Ukraine, especially some years ago, already told me that we will also be prepared for that kind of warfare. And as we know from other historical examples, that guerrilla warfare, if it is prepared, can be very, very successful, and it can harm all the foreign fighters in the country because they are dangerous. And the first, if you see the development in Crimea, for example, the 2 explosions that nobody can explain what really happened, one say already it is part of that of that guerrilla warfare. Maybe it can be, but I do not see it yet on the table. And how strong the Ukrainian forces will be in this kind of warfare, I would say they would have the better cards than the Russian side, because they are not really welcome in the population, and they are not prepared for that kind of warfare.
Okay, interesting points there. Ulrich, let me get your thoughts on this. I mean, when we look at how the Russians have been calibrating their moves within Ukraine, we hear reports of Russian attacks sometimes taking place as far west as Lviv. So no one can really, ascertain what exactly is the Russian strategy. Does Russia actually plan to invade the whole of the country, or is it just the eastern side of the country, or is it just the Donbass region?
Well, you said in the beginning that we do not speculate, and now that's exactly what we do. And there are so many scenarios that we can think about what happens if that no one, literally no one, no matter whether someone sits in the Kremlin or in Kiev or in the NATO headquarters, has any clue what that will lead to. Because there are so many possible exogenous factors, like what happens if one of the nuclear power plants blows up? And then is this a nuclear strike, and do we have to strike back? Or what happens if someone makes a serious mistake? So none of this has all of this has the potential to affect public opinion. And we in a pluralist society respond to public opinion. So the room for maneuver, what governments and collectively governments as members of NATO could do and decide, depends a lot on how reality is constructed, and not in the sense of this is reality that we can measure, but the reality how we talk about it. So given that we are deep in the fog of war, all of these scenarios, what happens if, or what is an appropriate response or so, doesn't lead to anything.
Okay, interesting points. I'm glad that we are having this discussion, because in the end, it's eventually going to lead us to talk about what could potentially bring this seemingly never-ending war to an end. But Thomas, before that, now, I also want to talk about the response given by the Ukrainians to the Russians. Now, not long ago, Amnesty International published a report in which it basically accused the Ukrainian military of placing its battalions near civilian populated areas, which basically in some ways corroborates what the Russians have been saying about Ukraine, that Ukraine is using civilians as human shield. Number one, what are your thoughts on that? And number two, don't you think such a strategy is prolonging this war?
I'm slightly reluctant to talk about the Amnesty report in some ways. I think something that's particularly telling around that report is the response to it. And from what I have seen, if anyone else can corroborate this, it has been essentially universal condemnation. The report, not to put too fine a point on it, in my opinion, is absolute tripe. It really does not capture the reality and context of the conflict that is occurring. I think in an ideal scenario, if we assume that war has to occur, in the ideal scenario, of course, civilians are nowhere near the site of conflict. I think the concept that the Ukrainian troops are deliberately putting civilians in harm to be using them as human shields it's possible, but I really think it's highly unlikely. And the reality is Ukrainian troops are attempting to defend their cities. They are attempting to defend Ukrainian cities. There is an option for those troops to just leave those cities and allow Russia to occupy them. Feasibly, they could do that. Politically, operationally, that would be ludicrous. So I think that the Amnesty report in itself has a number of flaws, and I would strongly recommend anyone who's reading it to read it, to think about what it's saying, and to read some of the other pieces of work that have been produced around it.
Okay, just to be fair to Amnesty, Amnesty also published a report accusing the Russians of war crimes across the country.
I'm not suggesting at all that it is improper to investigate what Ukrainian troops are doing. Absolutely not. That there is a real significance in ensuring that nobody is conducting war crimes. This situation, however, is not one where we can sort of both sides it. We can't, I think, say, okay, well, Russians are conducting war crimes here, Ukraine are conducting war crimes here, so it all balances out, which I think is the temptation when you start to see that second Ukrainian Amnesty report on Ukraine. We need to take this in isolation, and that report starts from a few false premises, in my opinion, around what is feasible and right for the Ukrainian troops to do in terms of how they engage with their allies.
Okay, interesting points there, Thomas. Now, Walter, let me come to you. This is a big question. I'm not sure if you have an answer to this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. what would bring this war to an end? What could possibly bring this war to an end?
I think the answer is quite simple. Mr. Putin can bring this war to an end, because we saw some attempts from the Western side, from the United Nations. The Secretary General tried to come into negotiations and it was ignored. It was neglected. So the Russian side defines how far it will go, and that will be defined how many resources they do have. So that is an interplay, I would say, of the political will, of the political purpose of the attack, and what can be achieved on the ground. So from my understanding, at the current situation, it is only in Putin's head to decide, now we stop the war and we tend to go into negotiations, or at least into talks. Negotiation will be the next step. But I do not see any possibility or any option from the Western side to negotiate without Putin's will.
Well, okay. Now, Ulrich, let me come to you. Now, this is a question which I'm sure, I don't think anyone has an answer to this question besides President Putin himself. Tell me, what is on Putin's mind?
Well, that was a funny question that we discussed from the moment troops appeared at the border. What is in his mind and why is he even flirting with the idea to invade? The moment it has been said no one has the intention to invade, for someone who lives in Berlin, it sounds like now it's happening, because that was exactly the same wording when Walter Ulbricht said that no one will erect a wall, and then a week later it happened. So I don't think that Putin wants to show what he thinks. So he said a lot of things, but this is also part of the confusion strategy, knowing that we sit in different systems. This is a systemic conflict. So a 19% inflation rate in Russia doesn't mean the same as an 8% inflation rate here. It hits us harder because we have a pluralist system. The same with what has been said before about the civilians and the high moral standards that the Ukrainian army has to fulfill. We have to report to our citizens, and we are in a system of free speech. So everyone can always construct the reality and criticize the government, because freedom is the freedom of the other, which will destabilize the ability and the, like in general in war, it's about how hit you can hard and also how much you can take. And this taking is undermined in a system that cannot oppress freedom of speech and can create a reality that the Russians don't question what is happening in the Kremlin. So we are not on equal footage, and that makes it difficult to lead a war, including what Walter said before about the aggression. I don't think that NATO would have kept their feet still if there is no nuclear threat that would be suicidal if we cross the red line. So if it would be any other international conflict, NATO would have been in immediately, and it wouldn't think about, would we appear as an aggressor or not? It's just a matter of survival, why we didn't send boots on the ground or actively participate as a party in war. So given that we have very different conditions in the two systems, any speculation about what Putin thinks or what we should do to make him think something else, he doesn't care about inflation and he doesn't care about the GDP. Maybe he even goes as far as throwing everything in that goes beyond our imagination. And then we have a giant country with the second largest arsenal imploding, and we definitely don't have a plan B what to do then if warlords or a dissolution of the country will be a situation that we think is better than a country in which Putin is in the Kremlin. I'm not saying that I want to continue this happening, but I also don't see that alternatives are by default better than the situation that we have right now.
Right. Interesting point. Great points there, Ulrich. Thomas, now, in an ideal world, I'm not sure to what extent the principles of an ideal world can be applied to Russia under President Putin, but in an ideal world, Putin would have liked to see this war come to an end, because the Russian economy is going through one of its worst phases in decades. Russia has come under sanctions by the West yet again. To what extent do you think, or perhaps for how much longer President Putin can afford, to get Russia sanctioned again and again by the West, to have the economy, get worse from this point onwards? To what extent can Putin afford? For how much longer can he do that, realistically?
I would love to be able to tell you 3 years, 4 months, 7 days, and 16 hours. That's the ideal. The reality is that we simply can't. I think, as Ulrich just absolutely nailed the answer before, I think it is incredibly difficult to understand the tipping point and understand what effect sanctions will ultimately have on the population. And I think this is the key point. For me, is a lot of the conversation.
I mean, see, here's one thing though. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, there's no bigger power than the power of the people. At one point, the Russian public might come forward and say, listen, we can't do it anymore. We can't afford bread. We can't, for example, we are seeing what's happening in countries such as Lebanon right now, right? I mean, if it does come to that, if the economy becomes so worse that people cannot afford some of the most basic necessities of life, do you think even at that point President Putin would move forward with what he's doing right now in Ukraine?
Potentially. It depends who the population are blaming. I think if he has managed to manipulates the wrong word, if he's managed to create this idea that, okay, you may be suffering, but I am the one who's actually alleviating this suffering, and if you continue to follow me, that suffering will reduce, then they're not going to rise up in that color revolution, as Walter was talking about before. I completely agree. I think that is a huge fear of his. And I think we have to really think about the function of those sanctions. What are we trying to do with them? Are we trying to prevent Russia's warfighting capability? Or are we trying to create a situation in which the Russian population start to oppose Putin? And I think there are two very different processes by which we would arrive at those endpoints, and we need to be quite careful about keeping those separate. I'm not particularly hopeful in the short term that Russian population would have the willingness and ability to topple the Putin regime. So I think in terms of ending this conflict, that is not a route which I think is going to be hugely productive. Okay.
Now, the last phase of this program, the future of Europe. Like I said in the very beginning of this transmission, Europe is one of the key stakeholders when it comes to the war in Ukraine. In fact, it is a continent which is being directly impacted by Russia's actions. So one question to each of you, and the question is, in the wake of the war in Ukraine, in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, what does the future hold for Europe? Walter, let me begin with you.
I would say EU is a learning institution. It is not comparable to a singular actor like China or like the United States or like Russia. So the learning process is a very important one. And the EU now had two opportunities to learn how to be better, how to become better. The first one was the pandemic, and the second one is the war in Ukraine. And there are two options for the further development. The first one is to have a fragmentation, or to have a consolidation. And what I see and observe since the beginning of the pandemic, and I would say that European Union is coming closer. Despite all the problems we have, look at Hungary and other actors, but there are only these two options, and I see Europe is going the way of more consolidation than less of fragmentation. I see it as a chance. I see it as an opportunity.
Okay, Ulrich, your thoughts on this?
Well, I think the answer says more about Walter than about the European Union, because this is pure wishful thinking. If we are all committed to European integration and we love to see multilateralism survive this, then sure, it will unite us, and we learn the hard way from terrible moments of crisis like the pandemic or the war in Ukraine. But we would only need to look at Italy, for example, and I don't see that the Fratelli learned any lesson from the pandemic or from the migration crisis or what's happening currently in Ukraine. And then we have a founding member state that is destabilizing the European Union in a moment in which we should not only stand united as the governments, but also win the hearts and minds of the people back home. So there are so many destabilizing factors that we cannot even foresee. We do not know what the situation in Germany is when we do have gas shortages that are not just hypothetical or we should shower a minute shorter. People are not used to this, and what it would lead to and what it means for the current government remains to be seen. And that then again affects the ability of the European Union to get its act together. So yes, I would agree as an optimist that the world should be a better place with more multilateral committed actors. But whether this is happening or not, who am I? Unfortunately, I didn't bring my crystal ball.
All right, well, let me put that to Thomas. Thomas?
Yeah, I think, again, I know I've rattled on about definitions before, but I think first of all, when we talk about Europe, I think we need to make sure that we are clear whether we're talking about the European Union or whether we're talking about individual states in Europe. So I'll just sort of leave that one on one side. And the second point that I would completely agree with Ulrich before, I think unusually the answer is we just don't know. There are so many different ways that the conflict in Ukraine could evolve. There are so many different ways that it could end, and all of those different pathways result potentially in different conclusions for Europe. And because of that, I think it's helpful for us to think about those potential different conclusions and think through how certain events could potentially impact the way in which European populations understand the conflict and want to respond. But the simple reality is we're not going to know whether those predictions, if you like, are true until they actually occur. And that makes it a really interesting discussion. It makes it an absolutely vital discussion, but it makes it a very, very difficult one as well.
All right. I mean, it's such a important topic, but unfortunately, we are out of time. I mean, I'm sure when it comes to the war in Ukraine and Russia, the West, there are many disagreements among analysts, but I think there is one thing that we can all agree on, is that every one of us wants to see an end to the sufferings of innocent civilians. Every one of us wants to see an end to the killings of innocent civilians. And I hope this discussion is going to somehow pave the way for policymakers to find ways to do that. So let me take this opportunity to thank Plus Debates for organizing this, and to Dr. Walter Feitinger, Ulrich Bruckner, and Dr. Thomas. Sorry for mispronouncing your name, and Dr. Thomas Hughes. Thanks very much once again for participating. I hope it was a fascinating discussion for all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks to our audience. I'm sure Plus Debates is going to organize debates in the future as well. So make sure you guys subscribe to their Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube page. It's been a fascinating discussion. Thanks very much once again, and goodbye.